How does a force of 4,000 men sail 8,000 miles to the most hostile weather in the southern hemisphere, with no contingency plans, ships loaded in the wrong order, and no air superiority? Conditions that American military assessors had concluded made a successful amphibious landing essentially impossible, and then put every single one of those men ashore without losing a single soldier in the process. How does the general commanding 13,000 troops, with a detailed plan to destroy the British landing force on the beach the moment it arrived, find himself unable to move a single soldier toward the coast because the helicopters his plan required had been burned, and the aircraft his plan required had been destroyed, and all of it had happened in the 6 days before the landing even began? And how does the nation that built the most celebrated Special Forces regiment in the world then cut its navy so aggressively that Argentina concluded it was no longer serious about defending anything, find itself scrambling a task force that had not been planned for, aboard ships that were not properly loaded, to retake islands for which no military contingency had ever been written? Before we continue, tell me in the comments whether you knew, before today, that the British landed at San Carlos against 19 Argentine soldiers and not 13,000. Because what you are about to discover is not a story about bravery against impossible odds. It is a story about a structure, the systematic dismantling of every Argentine capability that was supposed to make that landing impossible. Watch until the end, because the moment that defines this entire story is not the landing itself. It is what was destroyed in the 6 days before it. Then let's go. To understand what happened at San Carlos Water on the 21st of May, 1982, one must first understand the signal that Britain sent in the years preceding it, a signal it never intended to send, to an audience it had not considered. In 1981, Defense Secretary John Nott published a defense white paper that described plans to withdraw HMS Endurance from the South Atlantic. Endurance was an ice patrol vessel, not a warship in any serious operational sense. She carried 2 small helicopters, a crew of around 130, and a detachment of Royal Marines. What she represented, however, was presence. She was Britain's only permanent naval deployment in the South Atlantic, and her withdrawal communicated something precise to the government in Buenos Aires, that Britain was unwilling, and would soon be unable, to defend its territories in the region. Captain Nicholas Barker, her commanding officer, warned the Ministry of Defense that this signal was being read exactly as it appeared. He was not heeded. The government in Buenos Aires in late 1981 was not a stable one. General Leopoldo Galtieri had come to power in December of that year as part of a new junta facing serious domestic problems. The Argentine economy was failing. The regime's dirty war, the systematic kidnapping, torture, and murder of political opponents that had claimed somewhere between 9,000 and 30,000 lives had not been forgotten by the Argentine public, even if it had been obscured from international view. Admiral Jorge Anaya, the main architect of what followed, had concluded that the Falkland Islands, known in Argentina as the Malvinas, claimed since the 19th century, a cause that united Argentines across the political spectrum, could provide the distraction the junta required. He had further concluded that Britain would not respond militarily. The Endurance withdrawal confirmed what he already believed. On the 2nd of April 1982, Argentine amphibious commandos came ashore at Mullet Creek, south of Stanley. The garrison they faced consisted of 68 Royal Marines, 11 naval hydrographers, and 23 volunteers from the local Falkland Islands Defense Force. Major Mike Norman, commanding that garrison, organized a defense of Government House that cost the Argentines casualties they had not expected. He held for as long as holding was possible. When the governor, Sir Rex Hunt, ordered a ceasefire, Norman's Marines had inflicted more damage on a force of 4,000 than anyone in Buenos Aires had anticipated. They were then disarmed, photographed kneeling in the street, and repatriated. Brigadier General Mario Menendez was appointed military governor. Argentine flags replaced British ones over Government House. In London, the phone rang at 3:15 in the morning at the home of Brigadier Julian Thompson, commander of 3 Commando Brigade Royal Marines. His general spoke in guarded phrases. Argentina was about to invade the Falkland Islands. Thompson's first thought, by his own account, was that the bulk of his staff were in Denmark on an exercise reconnaissance. No contingency plan existed for the recovery of the Falkland Islands. None. The task force that sailed on the 5th of April was assembled from whatever was available, loaded in whatever order, ships could be reached and filled, and dispatched on a logistical tether 8,000 miles long to conduct an amphibious operation that the British military had not seriously practiced since Suez in 1956. Ships were not tactically loaded, which is the correct military term for ensuring that the equipment needed first arrives on an enemy shore first. Personnel were assigned to more than one vessel. Equipment found its way to the wrong units. The fleet stopped at Ascension Island, a small British territory in the mid-Atlantic, to redistribute stores and personnel, a process that itself illustrated how far from ready the force had been when it left Portsmouth. 2 events on the journey south changed the nature of what the task force was sailing toward. On the 25th of April, a smaller British force retook South Georgia Island from an Argentine garrison that surrendered after a naval bombardment demonstration. The message sent to London read, "Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the White Ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. God save the Queen." Thatcher told journalists outside Downing Street to just rejoice at that news. 8 days later, on the 2nd of May, HMS Conqueror, a nuclear-powered submarine, put 2 torpedoes into the Argentine cruiser, General Belgrano, south of the Falklands exclusion zone. 323 Argentine sailors died. Within 48 hours, the Argentine surface fleet had withdrawn to port for the remainder of the conflict. The naval threat to the landing was removed in a single engagement. 3 days after that, on the 4th of May, HMS Sheffield was struck by an Exocet missile. 20 crew members died. She was the first Royal Navy ship lost in action since the Second World War. The War Cabinet in London and the British public understood something they had not fully understood before. The ships were burning. It was against this backdrop, no contingency plans, a fleet improperly loaded, and a hemisphere from home, air superiority belonging to the other side, and the very recent knowledge of what an Exocet cost, that Julian Thompson and Commodore Michael Clapp sat aboard HMS Fearless and began planning the landing. What Thompson commanded was not a force designed for what it was being asked to do. 3 Commando Brigade consisted of 3 Royal Marine Commando battalions, 40, 42, and 45 Commando, augmented by the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the Parachute Regiment, along with artillery, engineers, and helicopters. The force totaled approximately 5,500 men. They were cold-weather specialists, trained for 14 winters in the Norwegian Arctic, and had been back from their most recent exercises there for a matter of weeks when Thompson's phone rang. They were as good as any force Britain had fielded in a generation. What they were not, and Thompson was explicit about this in his own account, was capable of conducting a contested amphibious landing against prepared defenses. The role of Commodore amphibious warfare had only recently been resurrected after lapsing. The doctrine had not been practiced in more than 25 years. American military analysis of the operation was consistent in identifying what was absent: sufficient amphibious assault vehicles for a contested beach, organic air cover over the landing zone, airborne early warning, and the pre-planned logistics that any textbook operation of this kind required. The United States Marine Corps, when it subsequently added the Falklands to its mandatory curriculum, noted that Operation Sutton was Britain's first amphibious assault since the 1950s, attempted without air superiority, with no contingency plans. At a distance, no North Atlantic Treaty Organization doctrine had contemplated. Thompson himself understood this. He stated it plainly. He wanted to land where the enemy was in light strength only, because he did not have the combat power to storm ashore against a well-prepared enemy position. The entire strategic logic of what followed was built on that constraint. The operation could not succeed as a frontal assault. It had to succeed as something else entirely. The command structure created its own complications. Thompson, Clapp, and Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward commanded their respective elements as parallel task group commanders, all nominally equal, reporting to Admiral John Fieldhouse at Northwood. Major General Jeremy Moore, who would eventually command all land forces on the islands, would not come ashore until 10 days after the initial landings. The arrangement was, as one later American analysis described it, a non-doctrinal construction that played havoc during execution. Trust between commanders was broken early and would take time to repair. These were the men who had to decide where 4,000 soldiers would put their feet on an enemy shore. They had one asset no doctrine had anticipated, and no headquarters could have produced. His name was Ewen Southby-Tailyour. In 1978, Southby-Tailyour had been posted to the Falkland Islands as commanding officer of Naval Party 8901, the small Royal Marines detachment permanently stationed there. He came from a Corps family. His father was General Sir Norman Tailyour, former Commandant General Royal Marines. He was also a serious sailor, a member of the Royal Yacht Squadron, who regarded the Falklands coastline as an unexplored paradise for yachtsmen. During his posting, on his own initiative, he sailed a small boat around the archipelago and filled a 126-page penciled notebook with tidal observations, water depths, beach gradients, and harbor profiles for every significant inlet and bay. It was the most comprehensive survey of the Falklands coastline since the mid-19th century. He returned to Britain in 1979. When he presented the notebook to the Royal Navy's chief hydrographer, the response was definitive. His surveys constituted, the hydrographer stated, the amateur jottings of an itinerant yachtsman and were of no value to this department. On the 2nd of April 1982, the day of the invasion, Southby-Tailyour arrived at the Royal Marines Barracks in Plymouth and presented his notebook to Thompson and Clapp. After a few minutes, in Thompson's own words, it was clear that he and his notebook and charts must come south with the fleet. Southby-Tailyour had one condition. He would not hand over the surveys unless he was given a role on the task force, not in an administrative capacity. He wanted to go. He was assigned as inshore navigational advisor to the amphibious commanders. He would later personally lead the waves of landing craft that put the troops ashore, navigating by the surveys he had made in peacetime in the belief that no one would ever need them. The hydrographer's verdict was not incidental to what followed. It is the structure of what followed. The single piece of intelligence that made the landing possible was produced by someone the official institution had dismissed, preserved only because he had insisted on a condition that guaranteed his presence. Thompson later wrote that if he were asked to name one man whose knowledge and expertise was irreplaceable in the planning and conduct of the amphibious operations, he would, without hesitation, name Ewen Southby-Tailyour. He was voted United Kingdom Yachtsman of the Year in 1982, not for sailing, but for everything the sailing had enabled. There is one further detail from his posting that the record of the campaign requires. Southby-Tailyour had, during his 1978 tour, removed the Falkland Islands governor's flag from Government House as a souvenir. During the campaign, he confessed the theft to Sir Rex Hunt and offered it back. Hunt told him he would be forgiven if he personally returned the flag to where he had taken it from. On the 17th of June 1982, Southby-Tailyour did exactly that. The location his notebook pointed toward, the one inlet whose depths, gradients, and terrain offered everything Thompson and Clapp required, was San Carlos Water. San Carlos Water sits on the northwestern coast of East Falkland, facing onto Falkland Sound, the strait separating the two main islands. It is sheltered, deep enough for the landing ships required, surrounded by high ground that would screen the fleet from Exocet missiles and complicate submarine approach. It lay approximately 56 miles from Stanley, where the bulk of the Argentine garrison was concentrated, far enough that Argentine ground forces could not rapidly respond to a landing there, close enough that the British troops who landed there could eventually reach the defensive positions around the capital. San Carlos Water was confirmed as the landing site on the 10th of May, 1982. The Argentine assessment of the same location had reached a similar conclusion by inverted logic. Argentine Navy officers had considered San Carlos Water and determined it was not a viable choice for an amphibious assault. The distance from Stanley, the terrain, the logistical challenge of sustaining a force at that remove, these were precisely the factors that led Argentine planners to leave the area without significant defenses. The location the British chose was the location the Argentines had dismissed. That calculation would shape the night. It would not have done so, however, without a painting. First Lieutenant Carlos Esteban commanded Combat Team Güemes, a 62-man detachment from Argentina's 25th Infantry Regiment, dispatched to the San Carlos area on the 15th of May. During his time there, Esteban visited the Port San Carlos settlement manager, a local farmer named Alan Miller, and noticed a painting on the wall of Miller's home. It depicted HMS Exeter riding at anchor in San Carlos Water following the 1939 Battle of the River Plate. Exeter was a heavy cruiser, considerably larger than a frigate. Esteban understood the implication immediately. If a vessel of that class could anchor in San Carlos Water, British landing ships could enter it. He reported upward. Large ships could enter the water. The area needed reinforcing. The report went upward. It was not acted upon. On the 13th of May, Thompson assembled his commanding officers in the wardroom of HMS Fearless. He opened with 2 words: "Gentlemen, orders." What followed was a 2-hour briefing covering the intelligence picture, the terrain, the landing assignments, and the contingencies for an opposed landing. Thompson did not tell his officers the date or time of the operation. He withheld that information until the last possible moment, partly for security, and partly because, the night before the briefing, Northwood had intercepted an Argentine radio signal originating from Port San Carlos. His staff had spent anxious hours assessing whether the landing site was compromised. It had not been. The signal came from a small reconnaissance element. The briefing proceeded. The full shape of Menendez's defensive plan was known to British intelligence by this point. He commanded 13,000 troops, concentrated primarily around Stanley. Knowing he could not defend every beach, his strategy was to respond to wherever the British landed. 15 helicopters, including 2 Chinook heavy-lift aircraft, would deliver soldiers directly to whichever beachhead the British established, once it was identified. Pucarás, ground attack aircraft operating from the airstrip on Pebble Island, north of West Falkland, would provide close air support against the landing force. Argentine air power from mainland bases would strike the fleet. The British would be caught between the sea and a responding ground force, under simultaneous air attack from multiple directions. It was a coherent defensive architecture. It depended entirely on the helicopters being present and the aircraft being airborne. Thompson closed his briefing with the words his officers would carry ashore with them. "May I remind you that this will be no picnic. Good luck, and stay flexible." Pebble Island is one of the smaller islands in the archipelago, 4 miles across at its widest point, north of West Falkland. After the Argentine invasion, the Air Force had established a forward operating base there, using the local grass airstrip to base 6 Pucara ground attack aircraft and 4 T-34 Mentor reconnaissance aircraft, along with a Skyvan transport, and approximately 150 Argentine personnel. The Pucara was purpose-built for exactly the kind of operation Menendez envisioned. It could operate from grass strips, carried two 20mm cannons and four 7.62mm machine guns, and flew at the altitude and speed required for close air support against landing craft and men exposed on a beach. On the 10th of May, an 8-man team from D Squadron, 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, paddled ashore at Pebble Island in Klepper canoes and spent 4 days observing the airstrip. On the night of the 14th of May, 45 men of D Squadron departed HMS Hermes in two Sea King helicopters of 846 Naval Air Squadron, landing 6 kilometers from the target. Mountain Troop was assigned the aircraft. The remaining personnel provided protection and an operational reserve. HMS Glamorgan positioned within range and waited. Within 30 minutes, the airstrip was illuminated by Glamorgan's naval gunfire. The fuel and ammunition dumps were burning, and the Special Air Service was moving through the parked aircraft in 2-man teams, laying charges and pulling fuel lines. The Argentine garrison was housed in nearby buildings. They did not emerge. 2 British soldiers were lightly wounded. In exchange, the raiding party left behind 6 burning Pucaras, 4 T-34 Mentors, and the Skyvine. One officer later described it as reminiscent of the type of operation the regiment had carried out in North Africa 40 years earlier. The Special Air Service boarded their helicopters and were back aboard Hermes before dawn. In half an hour's work by 45 men, half of Argentina's Pucara force based in the islands was destroyed. 6 days later, on the 20th of May, Special Air Service ground teams located a portion of Menendez's helicopter force and directed carrier-based Sea Harrier strikes against it. The attack destroyed Argentina's only 2 Chinook heavy-lift aircraft and 2 of the 6 Puma medium-lift helicopters. Menendez's plan to flood the beachhead with soldiers within hours of a British landing required those aircraft. They were now wreckage. There is one event from the approach to the landing that does not appear in most public accounts of what followed, but that the record of the operation demands. On the night of the 19th of May, 2 days before the landing craft moved, a Sea King helicopter of 846. Naval Air Squadron, transferring Special Air Service personnel between ships in darkness, flew into the sea. 18 Special Air Service soldiers and 2 crew members were killed. Among the dead were experienced senior non-commissioned officers who had planned and trained for the operations their regiment was about to execute. The cause was assessed as a probable bird strike. The regiment continued. At 2:15 on the morning of the 21st of May, HMS Yarmouth led the convoy into Falklands Sound. The fleet had held north of the Falklands on the 20th, waiting for darkness. The approach through the Sound was made at low speed, without lights. Against the British fleet stood Combat Team Guemes, Esteban's 62 men, the same unit whose commander had seen the painting of HMS Exeter and sent a warning upward that went unheeded. On the night of the landing, 19 of those 62 men were on the Fanning Head Promontory, the high ground commanding the entrance to San Carlos Water, manning 2 81mm mortars and 2 recoilless 105mm rifles. The other 43 were in Port San Carlos settlement, 3 kilometers away, with no functioning communications link. At 2:50, Esteban's outpost spotted the fleet and opened fire. The British response was immediate. Naval gunfire from the escorts and a 25-man special boat service team engaged the position. In the firefight that followed, the Argentines shot down 2 British Gazelle helicopters with small arms fire, among the very few successful Argentine ground actions of the entire landing phase. Under sustained fire, the outpost was suppressed, its communications equipment lost, the position neutralized. Esteban's men retreated into the darkness. The entrance to San Carlos Water was open. The special boat service had already marked the beaches. The landing craft began moving. Southby-Tailyour was in the first boat. the man whose surveys had identified this water, whose notebook the Royal Navy had dismissed, navigating by penciled charts through an inlet he had once explored alone on a yacht. He led the waves of landing craft toward beaches he had personally measured in peacetime. 40 Commando Royal Marines came ashore at Blue Beach, San Carlos, alongside the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment from the roll-on roll-off ferry Norland. The 3rd Battalion Parachute Regiment landed at Green Beach, Port San Carlos. 45 Commando came ashore at Red Beach, Ajax Bay. 42 Commando remained aboard the ocean liner SS Canberra in tactical reserve. Across East Falkland, 56 miles away in Stanley, 13,000 Argentine soldiers did not move. By first light, approximately 4,000 British troops were on the ground. More than 500 of them had been brought ashore by helicopter alone in those hours, along with more than 400 tons of supplies. The beachhead was established across 3 landing zones. Rapier surface-to-air missile batteries were beginning their deployment. The Argentine ground response, the helicopter-borne counterattack that Menendez's plan had promised, did not come. Not one British soldier died in the landing itself. Here is what that means. The story suggested by the title of this account, 800 British Marines against an entire army, is not the story that actually happened at San Carlos Water. It wasn't 800 against 13,000 on that beach. It was 4,000 against 19, because every mechanism that was supposed to make 13,000 soldiers relevant to the landing had been removed before the first landing craft moved. The genius of the operation was precisely that it avoided the impossible scenario entirely. The landing succeeded not because the British overcame impossible odds, but because they dismantled those odds before the landing began. The distinction matters. One is a story about courage. The other is a story about architecture. What came next was not from the ground. The carriers were positioned far to the east of the Falklands. Woodward had concluded that their loss would end the campaign and kept them out of reach of Argentine aircraft. This meant the Sea Harriers defending San Carlos had roughly 65 minutes of transit to and from the carriers, leaving approximately 10 minutes of effective combat time over the beachhead per sortie. The Rapier missile batteries were still being assembled and calibrated on the morning of the 21st. In the confined waters of the inlet, the warships forming the escort force had limited room to maneuver. The Argentine Air Force knew exactly where they were. What Argentina's pilots attempted across the following 5 days requires acknowledgement before the losses are counted, because the losses cannot be understood without it. They flew from air bases between 380 and 580 nautical miles away, the absolute limit of their combat radius. They arrived with fuel for one pass. If they missed, or were hit, or were turned by defensive fire, they could not circle and try again. They flew at wave-top height, navigating by visual reference at speeds that left almost no margin for error, knowing that any British aircraft they encountered would have the fuel advantage in any sustained engagement. By any professional measure, what those pilots attempted above San Carlos Water was extraordinary. Between 10:15 and 17:12 on the 21st of May, 17 sorties by the Argentine Air Force and Argentine Naval Aviation struck at the escort force. Daggers and A-4 Skyhawks attacked multiple ships. The Rapier batteries were not yet fully operational. In the engagements that followed, 13 Argentine aircraft were shot down. Only 2 of the 7 British warships in San Carlos Water escaped the day entirely undamaged. HMS Ardent bore the worst of it. Struck repeatedly across the afternoon, first by bombs that failed to explode, then by a wave of 5 Skyhawks that set her hangar ablaze and left her defenseless, she was abandoned with fires uncontrollable. She burned through the night and sank on the morning of the 22nd of May. 22 of her crew were dead. Bad weather over the Patagonian airfields on the 22nd grounded most Argentine aircraft. The Rapier batteries completed their deployment. On the 23rd, HMS Antelope was struck at the entrance to San Carlos water. 2 bombs entered the hull. Neither exploded. Staff Sergeant James Prescott of the Royal Engineers went into the hull to defuse them. While working on the first device, it detonated. Prescott was killed. The explosion ignited Antelope's magazine. She burned through the night, torn apart by secondary explosions, and sank before dawn. On the 24th, supply ships RFA Sir Galahad, RFA Sir Lancelot, and RFA Sir Tristram were struck by Argentine aircraft. Bombs entered all 3 vessels. None detonated. The 25th of May is Argentina's National Day. On that day, HMS Coventry, positioned in the Sound as a missile trap alongside HMS Broadsword, was struck by 3,000-pound bombs. Within 20 minutes, she was inverted, her keel above the water. 19 of her crew were dead. Later the same afternoon, 2 Argentine Super Étendard aircraft fired Exocet missiles toward the British carrier force. The missiles were decoyed away from their intended targets and struck the container ship MV Atlantic Conveyor, which had been requisitioned and was carrying equipment critical to the land campaign. She sank. Among her cargo were 6 Wessex helicopters, 3 Chinook heavy-lift aircraft, and 1 Lynx. The Chinooks were the aircraft intended to fly the bulk of the British ground force from San Carlos across East Falkland toward Stanley. With them gone, the troops would march. An electronic warfare officer aboard HMS Coventry later described the particular uselessness of his training in that environment. Anti-ship missile defense was what he had been prepared for. The procedures existed, the doctrine was sound, but the weapons now attacking his ship had no radar signatures to detect. There was no electronic countermeasure against an iron bomb. The institution had prepared for the threat it expected. It was being killed by the threat it had not anticipated. 5 days in the inlet had cost 4 ships sunk and more than 50 British personnel dead. 22 Argentine aircraft had been lost. The air battle was running out of aircraft on the Argentine side and running out of available targets on the British side because the landing ships were now well established ashore. The accounting of those 5 days contains one further entry that the record cannot pass over. At least 13 Argentine bombs struck British ships and did not explode. The reason was technical. Argentine pilots were flying so low to avoid the defensive fire that their bomb fuses did not have sufficient time in the air to arm before impact. 13 bombs that entered British hulls failed to kill the ships they hit. Admiral Woodward subsequently acknowledged that had those devices functioned as designed, Britain would surely have lost 5 more vessels. He further acknowledged, in an interview, that at the height of the attacks, he had been seriously considering phoning London to admit that the operation could not be sustained. The BBC World Service reportedly broadcast information about the fuse malfunction during the battle. Woodward later blamed the broadcast for alerting Argentina to the technical problem. Argentina modified its ordnance accordingly. By the time those modifications were in service, the battle for the beachhead was over. Sitting in San Carlos water throughout all 5 days of the air battle, in plain sight from any attacking aircraft, was the SS Canberra. She was a Cunard ocean liner painted white, an unmistakable and luminescent presence among gray warships and gray auxiliaries. Argentine pilots, attacking in the final seconds of their single permitted pass, struck the gray vessels. The Canberra was not hit. No one can fully account for why. The most straightforward military explanation is that Argentine pilots correctly prioritized the warships, which represented the greater tactical threat. The less comfortable explanation is that fortune was present in San Carlos water during those 5 days, and that it ran consistently in one direction. Argentine ground forces did not move. No counterattack is recorded throughout the land fighting. A defending platoon positioned on any of the ridgelines between San Carlos and Stanley could have halted the British advance for days, The ground dictated it. None tried. Menendez had drawn a ring around Stanley and had given no coherent thought to what fighting beyond that ring would require. Part of this was the consequence of what had been destroyed before the landing. The helicopter lift was gone. The ground attack aircraft were burning on Pebble Island. The observation post at Fanning Head had been suppressed in the dark. Part of it was something else. The conscripts who might have conducted a counterattack, had such an order been given, had been in the field for weeks in sub-zero conditions with inadequate clothing. Food rations arrived opened or with items missing. Punishment for absence without leave was reported to include beatings and enforced exposure to freezing water. Some conscripts reportedly died as a result of treatment by their own officers. When the Argentine garrison eventually surrendered at Stanley, many of its soldiers were malnourished. Menendez had no coherent defensive plan, but the men who might have executed one, had it existed, were in no condition to fight the force that came to find them. Political pressure from London was building before the beachhead was fully consolidated. Ships were being lost. The War Cabinet needed a visible land victory. The nearest significant Argentine position to San Carlos was the garrison at Darwin and Goose Green, on the narrow isthmus to the south. This was not in Thompson's original operational plan. It became the first major land battle of the campaign, for reasons that had as much to do with the Cabinet's requirement for news as with military logic. On the 28th and 29th of May, the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment attacked the Darwin and Goose Green positions. 450 men against approximately 1,200 Argentine defenders. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones, known throughout the regiment as H, was killed leading a charge against a machine gun position that had pinned his forward companies. He was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross. 17 British soldiers died at Goose Green. Approximately 55 Argentines were killed. 1,200 were taken prisoner. The loss of the Atlantic conveyors Chinooks had already forced a change to the advance plan. Instead of being flown toward Stanley, 45 Commando and the 3rd Battalion Parachute Regiment began walking. The terrain of East Falkland, peat bog, tussock grass, no roads, ridge after ridge commanding the routes, meant that even an unloaded Land Rover could move across it only at walking pace, with frequent stops to dig out. The Marines and paratroopers crossed it, carrying weapons and full equipment. In the vocabulary of the Royal Marines, the act became yomping. In the Parachute Regiment, it was tabbing. Both words entered the institutional language permanently. The Special Air Service had already secured Mount Kent, the dominant high ground west of Stanley, through a series of patrol skirmishes with Argentine Special Forces, holding it until 42 Commando arrived by helicopter and relieved them. By the 2nd of June, Thompson had 2 commandos and the 3rd Parachute Battalion on the ground, overlooking the approaches to the capital. The final battles were fought by night. Daylight movement over open ground, without air superiority, was suicidal. On the night of the 11th of June, Mount Longdon fell to the 3rd Parachute Battalion, 2 Sisters fell to 45 Commando, and Mount Harriet fell to 42 Commando. On the night of the 13th, the Scots Guards fought for Tumbledown Mountain against Argentine Marine defenders in engagements that participants later described as the most intense of the campaign. Sergeant Ian McKay of the 3rd Parachute Battalion was killed leading his section against an Argentine machine gun position during the battle for Mount Longdon. He was awarded the 2nd posthumous Victoria Cross of the conflict. Argentine resistance on the final ridgelines collapsed. On the 14th of June 1982, Brigadier General Menendez surrendered to Major General Jeremy Moore in Stanley. 593 Argentine personnel were held for intelligence purposes. The remainder were repatriated. The flag was raised again over Government House on the 17th of June. The last Argentine prisoners left the islands by the 14th of July. The full accounting of what the entire enterprise cost and what it actually revealed requires the same honesty the operations architects applied to their own planning. 255 British military personnel were killed in the conflict. 649 Argentine military personnel died. 3 Falkland Islanders were killed. 4 British ships were sunk by enemy action. The Atlantic conveyor was lost with her cargo. Multiple vessels sustained serious damage. The 22 men of HMS Ardent's crew, the 19 of HMS Coventry's, Staff Sergeant Prescott working in the dark of a ship's hull, these deaths were the price of the beachhead. They are not separable from the operation's success. What the near-miss analysis reveals is the magnitude of what survival required beyond skill and training. 13 unexploded bombs had landed inside British hulls. Had they detonated, Woodward placed the additional loss at 5 more warships in a fleet where the loss of either carrier would have ended the campaign, where the loss of the 2 assault ships Fearless and Intrepid would have stranded the landing force without extraction or resupply. The 2 exocets intended for the carriers found the Atlantic conveyor instead. The Canberra, fully visible and carrying thousands of troops, was not effectively targeted across 5 days of attack. Each of these outcomes required a different decision by an Argentine pilot, a different sequence of events, a different malfunction not occurring when it did. Woodward's own words placed it plainly. A fairly close run thing, fought along a knife edge. Caspar Weinberger, the United States Secretary of Defense and the strongest American advocate for supporting the British position throughout the crisis, wrote to President Reagan on the 19th of July, 1982. The battle for the Falklands, he wrote, appeared to have been a closer call than many would believe. The British won primarily because their forces, inferior in numbers, were superior in training, leadership, and equipment. Luck, he wrote, also played a significant part. Weinberger had personally ensured that the latest version of the American air-to-air Sidewinder missile was supplied to the British fleet from North Atlantic Treaty Organization stocks. The missile's all-aspect targeting capability made the Sea Harrier significantly more effective than it would otherwise have been. Thatcher later wrote that without the Harriers and their maneuverability, equipped with that version of the Sidewinder provided by Weinberger, the islands could not have been retaken. An American amphibious assault ship had been placed on standby against the possibility of a carrier being lost. Reagan's instruction to Weinberger, when the extent of British requirements became clear, was simple. Give Maggie everything she needs. The architecture of the operation was not solely British. The conditions that made it survivable were not built by Britain alone. The documented legacy of San Carlos water is both larger and stranger than the conventional Falklands narrative acknowledges. The Battle of San Carlos was the first occasion in history that a modern surface fleet armed with surface-to-air missiles and carrier-based air cover defended against full-scale land-based airstrikes. Every warship in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had its doctrine reviewed in the light of what those 5 days revealed. Close-in weapon systems, fast-firing cannon designed to engage aircraft and incoming missiles at short range, were retrofitted across the fleets of most major navies within years of the conflict. The Royal Navy's experience in the inlet had demonstrated definitively that Cold War anti-ship missile doctrine did not translate to iron bombs delivered by low-flying jets. The United States Naval Institute described the conflict as a gold mine of lessons. The United States Marine Corps added Operation Sutton to its mandatory study program. Senior British commanders from the campaign were invited to lecture at the Marine Corps University into the 2000s. The Naval Institute's December 2019 issue contained an observation that has not diminished in relevance since. Chinese military planners are studying the Falklands War. The same questions that San Carlos raised: how does a defending power hold contested islands against a maritime expeditionary force? What does the air battle above a beachhead cost? What is the calculus of a narrow strait approach under fire? Are the questions being examined in Chinese planning for potential operations over contested island chains in the Western Pacific? For those planners, San Carlos water is a case study in the vulnerability they are trying to create and the capability they are trying to deny. One might reasonably argue, as analysts of British amphibious logistics have, that even measured against Incheon and Suez, Operation Sutton was the most complex amphibious operation mounted since the Normandy landings of 1944, measured not by scale, but by distance, by time available for planning, and by the improvised nature of nearly every logistical element. Ships loaded in the wrong order, doctrine unpracticed for a generation, no contingency plans, a force prepared for the Norwegian Arctic deploying to the South Atlantic, political pressure throughout the campaign running against sound operational judgment. And yet the architecture that made the landing itself work was not improvised. San Carlos was not chosen at random. It was chosen because a man had surveyed it carefully enough to know it was viable, and had insisted on coming south to demonstrate why. Pebble Island was not raided impulsively. It was raided because weeks of reconnaissance had identified the Pucara as the specific threat that had to be eliminated before the landing craft moved. Fanning Head was not suppressed accidentally. The special boat service was there because the planning had identified that 19-man outpost as the one position capable of directing fire onto the fleet, and had arranged to engage it before the first soldier went ashore. The individual components were improvised. The structure was precise. The institutional verdict on Southby-Tailyour's notebook has not aged well. The chief hydrographer of the Royal Navy declared it the amateur jottings of an itinerant yachtsman, of no value to his department. The same institution that produced that verdict had no contingency plan for the operation that notebook made possible. The knowledge that proved irreplaceable was the knowledge the institution had officially classified as worthless. The man who held it had to negotiate his own presence on the fleet by refusing to cooperate unless they took him with them. That is not, finally, a lesson specific to the Falklands. It is a lesson about what institutions miss when they establish formal criteria for what counts as valuable knowledge and informal criteria for whose observations count as worth retaining. The hydrographer's assessment was not made in bad faith. It was made within a framework that had decided what the right kind of knowledge looked like and who the right kind of person was to produce it. The notebook was the wrong kind, produced the wrong way, offered by the wrong person. 4 years later, it was the only thing standing between the plan and failure. If you think the story of what made this landing possible, not the battle itself, but the structure behind it, deserves to be told fully, share this. Because the history of what happened at San Carlos water cannot compel your attention. Nothing is stopping you from giving it. And if you want to understand how the same principles, the preemptive dismantling of an opponent's capability, the value of knowledge an institution dismissed, shaped British military operations in the decades that followed, subscribe. Because this is not the first time an institution was saved by the thing it had officially disregarded. The pattern runs considerably further back than 1982. The record has been making the same argument for a very long time. The notebook was in the wardroom of HMS Fearless before the landing craft left.